Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Radine Kruger, and this lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Scibono Discovery Center, and it's broadcast by Bakama Research and Development. Okay, remember we have a WhatsApp line where you can send messages, not voice notes and not pictures, but just a normal message at 060 667 5044. All right, so let's have a look at the topic. Today we're going to have a look at the topic responding to the environment by humans, and we're going to look specifically at the human nervous system, the CNS or the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, nerves, and the reflex arc. All right, so let's have a look at responding to the environment. What does that mean? Okay, so in order for all organisms to survive, they must be able to respond to what's happening around them in the environment, whether it be outside of our bodies or inside our bodies. So, for example, what happens in your body when you see a car speeding towards you while you're crossing the road? Okay, you need to react very quickly. Your body then puts in motion a few responses that's going to get you out of danger. And the systems that actually do this, there's two systems in the human body, and we call them coordinating systems because they make sure that all the actions and reactions and responses work smoothly together and allow us to adapt to those changes in the environment. And so then they maintain a balance inside. All right, and these two systems are known as the nervous system and the endocrine system. And today we are specifically looking at the nervous system. All right, so what is nervous coordination? So that's when all the systems of the body, of an organism work smoothly together to ensure that the organism functions efficiently. So if you have a look at this diagram here, where you can see where there's a human body, and you can see that whole network of fibers that run through our body, and that is basically our nervous system. All right, and that nervous system allows us to react to our surroundings and then basically coordinate the response. So that if it's cold, like here, we're going to go and put on a jersey, or we'll close a window, or we'll switch on a heater or find a blanket or whatever. When it's hot, that's another stimulus that comes from outside. We then maybe drink water, we put on a fan, we take off our jersey, those kind of things. So the stimulus can come from outside the body, but it can also come from inside. Okay, so for example, when I'm tired, like in this diagram, or I'm hungry or I'm thirsty, my nervous system gets a message from my body, from the internal environment, and then it must now analyze that information and then react or cause a response or effect a response. So the stimulus can come from either inside or outside. Then in our bodies, in a lot of our organs, we have cells that we call receptors. And those receptors, they are able to pick up stimuli from the environment. And they then tell us that there's a change. So something has changed in the environment and our bodies need to respond. And then they're going to effect a signal that they've received from the stimulus, and that signal then is called a stimulus. Okay, so that is the basic concept. Also remember that receptors are very specific. So we have some receptors in our bodies that are sensitive to chemicals, some that are receptive to pressure, some that are receptive to light, for example, those in our eyes, some that are receptive to hearing, to sound, which is in our ears, which then helps us with hearing. So the various receptors are quite specific as to the stimulus that they pick up. Some are sensitive to pain, touch, pressure. So we have different receptors. All right. Now, how does a nervous reaction to stimulus or to stimuli in the environment occur? So how does our nervous system work? So first of all, we're going to get a stimulus, and this is going to come from the environment. So it'll either be inside or either the internal environment or external. So we get a stimulus. And then we have specific cells, because remember we said the cells are called receptors, and they are stimulated, and they then create an impulse, which is a little message that travels along your nerves or your neurons, and the neuron that picks up the impulse, the stimulus is a sensory neuron. So it's going to take the message towards the central nervous system. And your central nervous system, that's the analyzing or the control body. So that's the analyzing structure, and it's going to get the information, and then it must now decide what to do with that information. For example, that car that's speeding towards my body, towards me while I'm crossing the road. My brain has to quickly figure out, I need to jam my muscles that then get me running out of the path of the car, or it's my heart to beat fast or whatever. And that then will affect the response. So basically, our nervous system has 5 main functions. Okay, the first is that they must gather information. Okay, it's using our sense organs. So they're going to gather information from all over, internal environment and external environment. Secondly, they then must transmit, or that information must be transmitted to the processing areas in the brain. So it will take that information to the brain, and once it is in the brain, then the third thing is it's going to process that information. And when it has processed that information, it's going to formulate a response to the stimuli. And then when that response has been formulated, it then is going to send the information back through the network to your body, to the effector organs, and they are the ones that are going to actually bring about the response. All right. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at the central nervous system, which we often abbreviate, and it's accepted, the central nervous system, or we call it the CNS. And if you have a look at this diagram, we're just going to have a look at parts of it. So it's a part there that's circled in red, which is the central nervous system, and you can see it consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So if you have a look in this diagram here, we have the brain, and then traveling down from the brain is the spinal cord, and that runs through our vertebral column. So that's the part we're going to have a look at first. Okay, so first let's have a look at the brain. And if we look at the external structure of the brain, and there's a very nice diagram or picture of the brain. And remember, our brain is housed inside of a bony structure, and that is called the cranium. So that's the top part of our skull, and it's this part, and that houses the brain. And then that obviously acts as a protection. So the first line of protection is this hard, bony case that we have, the cranium for our brain. And then if we have a look, once we've removed the brain from the cranium, then we see that there are structures or membranes that we call meninges, and they line the surface of the brain. And there's 3 layers to those membranes, and those 3 layers then, between the middle and the inner layer, there's fluid that acts also like a cushion. So those 3 layers and the cerebrospinal fluid, as well as the cranium, they are all the protection of the brain. Then if we also have a look at the surface of the brain, you can see there's lots of folds and like grooves and ridges. And those we call gyri and sulci, or a singular one is a gyrus and a sulcus. And if you have a look at this little diagram here, you can see the indentation is the sulcus, and then the bump, that is the gyrus. Okay, so those are the folds and the grooves. And then we've got the next part, next structure, which is the brain stem. And then we have another part of the brain, which is called the cerebellum. And then the largest part, this upper part, that is known as the cerebrum. Okay, so that's the external structure. Then the internal structure, and here you need to know the basic parts of the brain, from the internal structure, and very briefly what their functions are. So here we're having a look at the brain from the inside now, not from the outside. And the first part we're going to look at, it's the largest part, and that is known as the cerebrum. Okay, so that's the upper part here. Remember, the brain is divided into two hemispheres, and a hemisphere means a half. So there's two hemispheres, and they are joined together to form the brain. Okay, so the first structure we're looking at is the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is the part of the brain that regulates your voluntary actions. So in other words, when I want to walk from here to there, it's my cerebrum that's going to get me to walk, because that's a voluntary. I can think about it and I can move there. It also is responsible for sensations, and remember, sensations is a word that comes from the word sense. And remember, it's my sense organs, my eyes, my ears, my skin, whatever, receptors inside of our bodies, they will then pick up stimuli. So those messages or impulses that came from the sense organs will then come to the cerebrum. It also is responsible for higher thought processes. So when I'm studying, when I have to write an exam, when I'm working in class, when I'm remembering things, whatever, those are the things then that are also controlled by my cerebrum. All right, the next structure we're going to look at is called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is very important in that it controls coordination. So in other words, I don't move like all over the show. My movements are smooth and coordinated. I'm able to balance. I can stand upright. I'm not going to fall over. If I do lean over, my body's telling me I must rectify. And also my muscle tone. It keeps your muscles in tone. So that is the functions of the cerebellum. Then we're going to have a look at the next structure, which we find in the brain stem, and that is known as the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata is a very important part because it regulates your breathing. Also peristalsis. Remember, that's muscular contractions in your blood vessels, in your digestive tract, in your urinary tract. So those are contractions of the smooth muscle. Also regulates heartbeats, swallowing, blinking, coughing, all of those autonomic responses. And it then also transmits. So it's kind of the connection between the rest of the brain and the spinal cord, which then is connected to the rest of the body. All right, so that's your medulla oblongata. Then we have a structure that we find at the base of the brain there. It's called the pituitary gland, which is actually an endocrine gland. And when you do the endocrine system, you'll learn more about it. So basically, it secretes hormones. So we're not going to go into detail with this now, but just so that you know that is where the structure is, and it is regulated by the brain. All right, then we're going to have a look at the next part, which is known as the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is your control center that tells you I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm tired. So it's responsible for hunger, thirst, sleep, body temperature, emotions, those kind of reactions. And then the last part that we're going to have a look at in the internal structure is that white part there, sort of in the middle, and that is known as the corpus callosum, okay, which literally is the white body. And what it does is it basically joins your two hemispheres so that we have the two halves of the brain are connected so that there are impulses that can pass between the two hemispheres. All right, so that's the internal structure of the brain. All right, so let's have a look. Usually the questions that we get based on the structure of the brain, would be on those parts that are mentioned in this previous slide. Okay, so the first question that we would get is give the names of the parts labeled A to C. So we're going to have a look at A, B. We need to name those parts, A, B, and C. And if we have a look, A would be the cerebrum, and B is the corpus callosum. Remember, I said that's the part that joins the two hemispheres. And then C is the cerebellum. And remember to learn the difference between cerebrum and cerebellum. So they sound similar, but they're not. And they definitely have different functions. Right, then the next question says, give the letter and name of the part responsible for coordinating all voluntary movement. And remember I said to you, there's a part of my brain that's going to say, if I want to walk over to the other side of the room, it's that part of the brain that's going to come into action. So that, and here in this question, they ask you for the letter and the name. And that is why this question is worth 2 marks. Okay, so remember you need to write down both. So I'm going to have a look on my diagram, and I'm going to identify that structure. And it's going to be, okay, no, it's for coordinating all voluntary actions. Okay, and that would be my cerebellum. Remember we said that it's going to coordinate so that my movements are nice and smooth and not jerky. Okay, then the second part, B, question B, says the part that is responsible for memorizing a cell phone number. And that was part of my higher thought processes. So that would be A, which is the cerebrum. Then they ask us to explain 2 functions of part E. Firstly, and we said part E is the medulla oblongata, and that controls breathing, peristalsis, heartbeat, and swallowing. It also transmits impulses, so it's the connection between the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. It also controls less important reflexes, such as blinking, coughing, sneezing. Remember, we also said that. And then also vasodilation. You remember what vasodilation is? I don't know if we haven't actually done that yet, but vasodilation is when your blood vessels dilate. So in other words, they get bigger. And then vasoconstriction is when they get smaller. And salivating. So in other words, when saliva comes into my mouth. All right, and then the part F, we need to explain 2 functions there. And part F, we said, was the hypothalamus. And basically that's the control center for things such as hunger, thirst, sleep, body temperature, and emotions. Okay, and you can answer any 2 of those. Right, then the next question. Provide 2 ways in which part D is protected. Okay, so if we have a look down here, part D, and that's our spinal cord. And remember I said to you the brain is housed inside of a bony structure, the cranium, and there's membranes that line it. Now, those membranes extend from the brain down the spinal cord. And remember earlier I said to you your spinal cord runs down your vertebral column. So again, the protective structures, the spinal cord is protected by vertebrae, that's bone, and that has cartilage discs between it, that acts as shock absorbers, and then it also has the membranes, those meninges that line the brain, then extend down the spinal cord, called meninges, and also between the inner and the middle layer, that fluid continues down the spinal cord, which is cerebrospinal fluid. So any 2 of those 3 you can mention as the protective mechanism or the protective structures of either the brain or the spinal cord. All right, then question 5. Which functions of the body might be affected if the lower back part of the head, so in other words down here, receives a significant impact in a car accident? Okay, so let's have a look. That would be the medulla oblongata. So that's down here in your neck or just below. your brain, and that would be affected. And if that is affected, then it could lead to problems with obviously breathing, your heartbeat, digestion, communication between the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so any of those functions that's normally carried out by the medulla oblongata, those then would be affected. All right, now in this question, they've given us an extract, and then they ask you to read the extract and then answer the questions. So here they say, or the article is called A Link Between Concussion and Brain Damage. So in 2002, a former American football player was found dead in his truck. The doctor who handled the autopsy discovered that the football player had severe brain damage and that his death was caused by repeated blows to the head or repeated concussions. He called this disorder chronic traumatic encephalopathy, okay, or CTE. A more recent study was conducted that involved the brains of 165 people who played football at high school, college, or at a professional level, and the study found evidence of CTE in 131 of the brains. Okay, so let's see the questions that are linked to this. The part of the brain affected by CTE is the cerebrum. State 2 possible symptoms of this disorder. So now we've got to go back and think about what did we say were the functions of the cerebrum, and then that is how we would then tailor our answer and say those would be affected, so that would be possibly symptoms. So the first one would be possibly loss of higher thought processes, loss of memory, judgment problems, problem solving, or any of the functions of our cerebrum, or any other example. We also might have a loss of one or more of our senses. Might be a loss of smell, there might be a loss of hearing, might be a loss of sight, even speech. So that could be one of the symptoms. And then also we could have a loss of voluntary actions or paralysis. Okay. Then the second question, state one way in which the brain is protected. Okay, so this is why it's important that we also, besides knowing the structure of the brain, we also must learn and know the parts that actually protect the brain. And that could either be the skull or the cranium. The specific part that houses the brain of the skull is known as the cranium, or you can just say the skull. The meninges, remember those were the three membranes. And, you know, we don't necessarily have to learn all three names, but if you have learned and you do know, they're known. The outer one is known as the dura mater, the middle one is known as the arachnoid mater, and the inner one is known as the pia mater. Okay, and then also the cerebrospinal fluid, which is fluid that we find between the inner and the middle meninges. Right, explain. The third question says, explain why CTE does not usually affect essential life processes such as breathing or heart rate. And remember, they said to us that CTE affects the cerebrum. So that is why it affects the cerebrum. It affects the cerebrum. So therefore, the medulla oblongata, which carries out those functions, which controls your breathing, your heart rate, is generally not damaged. So that's why it wouldn't affect those processes. All right. Then the next part of the nervous system we're going to have a look at is the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. And that basically has two parts. We have the sensory pathway, which is the pathway that comes from the sense organs to the central nervous system. And then we have the motor pathway, which goes from CNS to organs and glands and structures in our body. Our motor pathway is divided into two parts. It's a somatic, or the voluntary nervous system, and then we also have another part which is known as the autonomic nervous system. And that part, the name tells you it's control, or it's part of your automatic responses. And that is divided into two parts known as the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Okay, and those are all the network of nerves that you can see in the body. All right, the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, consists of all those nerves that branch out from the CNS. So in other words, in the cranium, in your head, you have some nerves that branch off, and then in our bodies from the spinal cord. They all then connect the different parts of the body to the central nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system, that is responsible for all your conscious activities, your skin and your skeletal system, and the autonomic nervous system, those are all the unconscious things. So while I'm talking to you, and we're learning this, I'm not thinking about I need to breathe. My breathing is happening automatically. Or I need to digest my lunch. It's happening automatically. So that's all covered by the autonomic nervous system. All right. Then if we have a look at the autonomic nervous system, as I said, it's divided into two parts. And if you have a look at this diagram, it shows actually very nicely. We have the sympathetic part, and then we have the parasympathetic part. And those two parts work opposite to each other. So they then have an opposite effect. So one would stimulate, and your sympathetic nervous or pathway, that is the one that stimulates. So what it does is it dilates your pupils, it inhibits salivation, it relaxes the bronchi, so if the bronchi widen, more air can come in, get your heartbeat working faster. It inhibits digestion. I don't need digestion happening when I need to be reacting. It stimulates glucose release by the liver. It gets adrenaline going, relaxes the bladder, and it contracts the rectum. And those are all the reactions. So when I'm standing in the middle of the road, or I'm crossing the road and I see that car speeding towards me, the part of the nervous system that reacts is the sympathetic nervous system. And it gets me out of the way. And then once I jump out of the way, I can't carry on. My body can't function at that high level all the time. So now what happens is now my body needs to go back to normal. I need to go back out of that extraordinary situation, back to normal functioning, and that is the part of the parasympathetic. And so if you have a look at the reactions of the parasympathetic nervous system, you can see it has the opposite effect. So where the sympathetic nervous system dilated the pupils, made them get bigger so that more light goes in, my parasympathetic is now going to constrict the pupils. Okay, so if you have a look at all the functions, you'll see it is opposite. So it is the inhibiting part. Then each organ is innervated by the sympathetic nerve and the parasympathetic nerve. That means it's stimulated by those nerves. And we call this double innervation because there's one that stimulates and one that inhibits. And an example will be in the pupil of the eye, or in your eye, that allows the pupil either to dilate or to constrict. All right, and that's, we're going to take a break now. And after the break, then Vedika will be carrying on with you. Thank you.
Good day, grade 12 learners. My name is Vedika Maraj, and I'm going to be continuing the session on human responses to the environment. Thank you, Radine, for your presentation. I'm going to be moving on with the nerves. So you'll remember that Radine mentioned the nerves quite a bit. So let's look at them in more detail. So the nerve is the structure that sends and carries signals to and from all parts of the body, and it is made up of neurons. And to be specific, actually, if you look at this diagram over here, it shows you the structure of the neuron, and it shows you that it is made up of, sorry, the structure of the nerve, and it is made up of many neurons. Um, they are held together by connective tissue, and you have millions of neurons within this nerve. So looking at neurons specifically, what are neurons? Neurons are nerve cells. So they are actually the basic unit of the nervous system. They are specialized cells and which connect the brain and the spinal cord to all other parts of the body. Each neuron has the following parts. It has a cell body, it has dendrites, and it has an axon. If we first look at the word cell body, the cell body consists of a nucleus surrounded by cytoplasm, and it carries out the basic functioning that a cell carries out. So it controls the metabolism of this whole cell. So there has a nucleus and a cytoplasm, and that is the cell body. Then we have the dendrites. The dendrites carries the impulse to the cell body. The dendrites, it carries the impulse towards the cell body, and the axon carries the impulse away from the cell body. We're going to look at it in more detail when I show you the specific neurons that we have. Then we carry on with the neurons. I want to talk a little bit more about the axons and the dendrites. The axons and the dendrites have a myelin sheath, and it has a specific functions. But before we carry on with that, we are going to have a 5-minute break, and we'll be back with you in the next 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back. Sorry about that. We just had a few technical difficulties, but we are back on track. So let's continue from where I stopped. We were doing the structure and function of the neuron. We spoke about, let's just recap a little bit. We spoke about how the neuron is a nerve cell. It's the basic unit of the nervous system, and that there are specialized cells which connect the brain and the spinal cord to all other parts of the body. It's made up of a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. Going into more detail on the axon and the dendrites, the axon and the dendrites have a myelin sheath. It's a fatty layer which is wrapped around them. So before I go into the functioning, I want us to maybe give an example or analogy of something that you understand in real life that can relate to how a neuron works. So if you can imagine the neuron being like an electrical cable, where the axon running down the center is like the copper wires that are inside the cable. And then you think of the myelin sheath on the outside being that plastic coating or that plastic layer on the outside of the cable. Okay, so the same way that that plastic cover insulates, has an insulating function, it's the same way the fatty myelin sheath has an insulating function. It also has this function where it speeds up the transmission of impulses, and it also keeps the impulses from escaping. Okay, it helps them to go in one direction. So that is the function of the myelin sheath, and they surround the axons and the dendrites as for insulation and speeding up the transmission of these impulses. So let's look at the specific neurons. I actually want to do the sensory neuron first. So let's look at the sensory neuron. Here we have, look at the picture first. We have the sensory neuron. We have a receptor cell over here. And the basic function of the sensory neuron is that it transmits the impulses from the sense organs or the receptors to the central nervous system, right? Shortened to the CNS, which is an accepted abbreviation, as Radine has mentioned earlier. These are also known as afferent neurons, and they are sensitive to stimuli in the environment. So how it works, let's first look at the structure before we look at how it works. Okay, so we can see here that we have the axon and the dendrites, which are surrounded by the myelin sheath. We have the cell body over here, and we have the direction of the impulse. So how it actually works is that there's a receptor, okay? The dendrites in the sensory neuron are going to pick up the impulse from there. So first, the receptor cell is going to recognize a stimulus, right? Which is the change in the environment. So the receptor is going to recognize the stimulus. The stimulus is going to be converted into a nerve impulse, and that nerve impulse is going to then be picked up by the sensory neuron, by the dendrites, and it's going to travel towards the cell body. Then we're going to have the axon that's going to come into play, and it's going to carry the impulse through the axon down to the terminal branches here at the bottom. Okay, so that's why the direction of the impulse is going downwards, because in this direction is the direction of the impulse in the sensory neuron. Okay. Then we're going to look at the interneuron. Okay, the interneuron, inter meaning between. It is the one that actually joins the sensory and the motor neuron. It's found in the brain and the spinal cord. It receives impulses from the sense organs, and it connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. So this is it's also known as the connector neuron. So inter meaning between, and then connector, that it connects the two different neurons. So when we look at this neuron, you will see that it has many dendrites. You can see these branches that look like trees. These are the outgrowths that are called dendrites. And it's going to, once again, it will pick up the impulse. Now, these dendrites will pick up the impulse from the terminal branches of the sensory neuron. The impulse will go from the terminal branches of the sensory neuron. It will be picked up by the dendrites, which receives the impulse and takes it to the cell body, right? That's the basic function of the dendrite. Then from the cell body, the impulse will be taken away from the cell body and via the axon. And once again, the direction of impulse, it's going in the downwards direction. Now let's just go back to the previous slide. The motor neuron. This is the last type of motor neuron that we get. They are also known as efferent neurons, and they transmit the impulse from the CNS to the effectors, which are the muscles and glands, and the effectors bring about a response. Okay, so the sensory neuron is the one that is going to pick up the impulse from the sense organs and from the senses, and it's going to take the information to the central nervous system, whereas the motor neuron is going to take the information from the central nervous system to bring about a response, okay, to that stimulus. So in this instance, let's look at the motor neuron. You will see here that it starts with this star-like structure at the top. Once again, you've got these outgrowths, these many outgrowths over here, which are called the dendrites. These dendrites are now going to receive the impulse from the terminal branches of the connector neuron or the interneuron, right? And then those impulses are going to be taken to the cell body. Then we have one outgrowth, which is the axon, and the impulse is going to travel along that axon, and that is going away from the cell body to the terminal branches. It's going to end here in like an effector organ, which is a gland or an organ, where it's going to carry out a response. Okay, and once again, the direction of the impulse in this instance, it's going downwards. Okay, from the cell body down to the terminal branches. Right, let's do an activity on the structure and function of a neuron. The diagram below represents a neuron in a human. So once again, when we look at a picture, remember, we always have to first analyze the picture. What are we looking at over here? So if you just looked at the different structures, we looked at the sensory neuron, the interneuron, and the motor neuron. And the one we just did now, it looks exactly like this one. So it is a motor neuron. And I want you to take note of the labels as well. When you see the picture, you should also label everything so that your brain can already start thinking about what the questions are going to be asking us. Right, so if we look at A, what is A? They are the dendrites. Right, what is B? B is the axon. Take special care to why I say it's the axon. Look at that label line. That label line is pointing to that darkened solid line in the center. And then we have C. What is C? C is the myelin sheath, because it is the fatty layer, the outer coating. As I said, it surrounds the axon, is that outer fatty layer, which is called the myelin sheath. So it's very important that you look at your labels very carefully. Let's answer the questions. Number 1, identify the type of neuron represented by the diagram. I unfortunately already gave you that answer, and it is the motor neuron, also known as the efferent neuron. So you see, by analyzing the picture and already the diagram and already letting your brain think about what is this, what is it going to do, you've already actually answered the first question. Number 2, state one function of part B. Okay, part B, like we said, it was the axon. If you didn't label it as the axon, then how would you know what the function is? Okay, so you ask yourself firstly, what is it? It's the axon. What does it do? It transmits the impulse away from the cell body, or you could say it transmits the impulse to the effector. Now, the reason why I put 2 points here is because those are the 2 possible answers. But it's important that we look at our question. And our question says, state one function. So the instruction is telling us to give one function. So you only give one. If you give 2 functions in the exam and the first one is incorrect, the first option you give is incorrect, and the second one is correct, they will not give you the mark, because we mark the first one because the instruction asked you to mark that we only want one function. Okay? Then the last question, explain the role of C in the functioning of the neuron. And C is the myelin sheath, and it conducts the impulse faster or prevents a short circuit, and it insulates the neuron. Right, now we're moving on to reflex actions and reflex arcs. You can get questions on the structure and function of a neuron even in reflex arc questions. So we're going to do a few of them later on again. If you feel that we haven't really quite covered the structure and function, you're not really so sure about everything yet. Right, reflex action and reflex arc. This is my favorite part of the nervous system. The reflex action is a quick automatic response to a stimulus. It's something that's quick, it's fast, automatic meaning that it's involuntary, you don't think about it, and it's a response to a specific stimulus. Usually it's a stimulus that is detecting danger, and that's why it's going to make you respond quickly. Examples of these is a knee jerk, sneezing, and quickly removing a body part away from danger to respond to pain. The reflex arc is the pathway along which an impulse is transmitted to bring about the response to a stimulus during a reflex action. So it's very important that we understand the difference between these two terms, because they almost always ask them somewhere in a biological terms or in a question. And it's important that we understand that the reflex action is the automatic response. That is what is happening. But the reflex arc is the actual pathway that the impulse is going to travel to bring about that response, which is the reflex action. Okay, so that is the difference. The nervous impulse goes to the spinal cord, and then an impulse passes from the spinal cord directly to an effector to give an immediate response. So what usually happens is we have the sensory neurons, they're very long. Right? Sensory neurons are very long. Motor neurons are very long. The sensory neurons are going to take the impulse. It can take them to the brain. Okay. And then we have the connections happening, and then we have a motor neuron which is carrying out a response. But in this instance, we are bypassing the brain. We are like taking a shortcut into the spinal cord so that we can have a faster one. We don't have time for it to travel all the way to the brain, even though that is also fast, but we need it to be faster. The significance of the reflex action is that it allows for a quick response without thinking about it to prevent damage to the body. Okay, so it's basically to protect you from danger. Please take note of my little speech bubble over there. Always talk about an impulse and never a message. You will see that Radine and I have not been speaking about messages because that is the incorrect terminology. We also don't want you to use it. And we are saying it here because we see it all the time, and you do not get marks if you say message instead of impulse. So don't do that. Okay? Right, so let's look at this reflex action. We're first going to use it, look at it as a diagram, and then I'll give you specific points on how you are going to describe a reflex action, a reflex arc. Right. So here we have the reflex arc, and we look at the diagram, you have this part over here, this arrow is showing us the central nervous system, which in this instance is the spinal cord. I just want to draw some attention to the spinal cord so that you know how to identify this, because that's also been an issue that we've seen in the past where when learners were asked to draw the reflex arc, they couldn't really draw this spinal cord part. So the outer layer of the spinal cord, it's the white matter, and this H shape in the center, this H shape or this butterfly shape is the gray matter. It's opposite to how it is in the brain. Okay, so and then we have in the center over here, we have the central canal, and it is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And we also have a dorsal side, right, which is this upper side, and then we have a ventral side. Okay, so that's just to orientate yourself on the spinal cord. Now we go through this actual reflex arc. What is happening here is that we have the stimulus. Let's start at the beginning. The beginning would be starting at the stimulus. In this instance, it's a hot stove or a hot plate on a stove. Okay, the sensory receptor in the skin is going to pick up this change in the environment, which is the stimulus. It's going to convert it into a nerve impulse, and that nerve impulse is going to be picked up by the sensory neuron. It's going to travel along this very long sensory neuron, and it's going to enter the spinal cord via the dorsal root, right? Via the dorsal root. and then it's going to enter the gray matter of the spinal cord, and it's going to make a connection called the synapse with the connector neuron. Then that connector neuron will let the impulse, or take the impulse from the sensory neuron into the connector neuron. The connector neuron will take the impulse to the to the motor neuron. The motor neuron will then take the impulse, or carry the impulse along its axon out the ventral root of the spinal cord, and it's going to make a connection here with the effector organ. In this instance, it is the biceps in the arm. Okay, and then the response is going to be the hand will be withdrawn. Okay, so that is the basic pathway. I want to draw your attention to a few things. When you have to actually see in which direction this is going, you must look at the arrows. Okay, usually there will be arrows that will show you the direction of the impulse. Okay, so if you're asked to draw this, you would do the same. Okay, you must have your arrows to indicate which way the impulse is going, even if you have to be asked to draw a motor neuron. If you look at this, the arrows are showing you that we are going this way into the spinal cord and then coming out the bottom. Then the other thing is, how do you identify which neurons they are? Okay, so firstly, you know that the sensory neuron is going to be the one that is going to be picking up, being linked to the receptor, right, to pick up the stimulus. And then the motor neuron is going to be the one coming out, and it's going to be linked to the effector. Another way is to look at the structure of the neuron. Remember, the sensory neuron has the cell body like sort of in the center there, and the motor neuron has the cell body at the start on the one end with the long axon. I just want to explain to you the other pathway over here. You will see here there's a negative here and here. It's basically indicating to us that this gland, or this organ is effector muscle is going to be inhibited, because remember from grade 10, your biceps and your triceps they work antagonistically. So when the one is going to be stimulated, the other one is going to relax, and that's how the arm is going to move away. Then the third pathway over here is showing you that there is an impulse that is carried to the brain, and it's carried to the brain so that pain can be registered. Okay, so if you've touched something hot, it's not like you didn't feel the burn. It's not like it was so fast that you didn't feel it. You do still feel it, but and you do sometimes get a burn, but it's preventing you from getting a burn that could be worse. Okay, or preventing you from being in more danger. Right, so that is the reflex arc. Let's do a question to see if we understood that. Okay, so firstly, let's do number 1, identify the parts 1, 2, and 5. Number 1 is the cerebrum. Number 2, it is the medulla oblongata. And number 5 is the cerebellum. Okay, I'm just doing that quickly because we did do it earlier on, and by now you should know those different parts. Okay, and then number 2, what will be the effect on the body if part 5 is damaged? This is also something that Radine did. She explained to you when we did the structure of the brain, the function of the cerebellum. So now you have to say, if the cerebellum is damaged, what would happen? Okay, so let's think about it a little bit. We would have lack of muscle control, lack of coordination, bad posture. You would have an upset equilibrium. Okay, those are the answers. And lastly, I'm coming to the reflex action shown in the diagram. They're asking you to describe it. So a describe question, you describe the process, you put it in point form, all your facts one under each other of what is happening here. Okay, so what do we start with? We start at the beginning, and as I mentioned to you, the beginning would be the stimulus. In this one is actually showing us the knee-jerk response or reflex action. And you will see that they use a hammer. It's a rubberized hammer to actually knock just below the patella, which is the knee. And then the response would be, so the stimulus is going to be the hammer. the sensory neuron, you see, how do we know that it's the start? I also looked at this diagram at first and I'm like, okay, where's the beginning? So what do? The first thing I thought was, look at the arrows, right? Look at the arrows. This arrow is showing us it's going here into the spinal cord. And you will see that then this receptor is going to pick up the stimulus. It's going to go via the dorsal root of the spinal cord. It's going to enter the gray matter. The sensory neuron is going to make a connection with the interneuron, which will make a connection with the motor neuron. It will exit via the ventral root, and it will go to the effector to carry out a response. Let's look at the answers, and we can look at the specific answers of how we would say it. I'm going to go a little bit slowly here because this reflex action is very important that you be able to describe it. I also want to mention that when you are asked to describe something like this with a reflex action, you need to be specific about what you're talking about if you're talking about the stimulus. For example, we're starting with saying that the hammer strikes the knee. Now, because I taught you with the example of the hot stove, when you are describing it, you have to relate it to this specific question. Okay, so we are talking about the hammer that strikes the knee. Or here they're saying stimulating the receptors, right? The stimulus is converted into an impulse to be transmitted along the sensory neuron, right, to the dorsal horn, where the sensory neuron makes a synapse. Okay, so it makes a connection or a synapse with an interneuron. The impulse moves along the interneuron to the motor neuron via a synapse. So we have another synapse over there. And moves along the motor neuron via the ventral root to the effector, or the muscle in the leg, which reacts, and the leg is then raised upwards. Okay, so those are your main points. The main points is that you must identify that there was a stimulus. It was converted into an impulse. Then it goes via the sensory neuron through the dorsal horn or the dorsal root. It makes a synapse with the interneuron, which then makes a synapse with the motor neuron, which takes the impulse via the ventral root out of the spinal cord to the effector organ or gland, where it's going to carry out a response. Right, let's look at the diagnostic report for 2021. So this was a question that was asked in the 2021 NSC examination. And it's one where we realized that there were certain problems in the way learners answered this question. Right, let's look at the first one. Explain how the speed of transmission of impulses will differ for neuron 1 and neuron 2. Now, actually, I made a mistake. Remember, we first look at the diagram. Let's look at the diagram. We have neuron 1 and neuron 2 over there. And if you can see, they actually look the same. They're the same type of neuron. That's what you should identify first. And then you should identify that there's something different. It's like playing spot the difference here. What's the main difference that you can see between neuron 1 and neuron 2? This one looks naked, eh? There's nothing there. So it doesn't have a myelin sheath, whereas this one has a myelin sheath. Okay. But they're not asking you what is the difference. Now we look at the question. Okay, what is the question asking us? They're not asking us what the difference is. They're asking us to explain how the speed of transmission of impulses will differ for neuron 1 and neuron 2. So when they're asking you to explain how something differs, they are wanting us to make a comparison. Okay, and that is the main thing that learners missed, was that they didn't realize that they must actually compare. And then we have to look at the word speed of transmission. Okay, that is telling us that it's got to do with the myelin sheath, because the function of the myelin sheath is to speed up the transmission. Okay, so even if you didn't spot the difference over there and you saw that was different, the question is actually leading you to say that this is about the speed of transmission and why are these two diagrams different. Okay, so let's look at how we're going to, before we look at the answer, let's think about it for half a minute. Okay, think about what I said. How are they different? Okay, and how is this actually going to affect the speed of transmission? Right, let's look at the answer. Impulses will be transmitted faster in neuron 1. Okay? So the answer in the question, you are saying how is the speed going to be affected? It is going to be transmitted faster in neuron 1. But we cannot stop there because we need to explain why. And the reason why is because of the presence of the myelin sheath in neuron 1. Why can we not stop there? Because they are asking us to compare. They are asking us for the difference. How do they differ? And that's why you need to add that neuron 2 does not have that myelin sheath. Okay, so let's go through it again. The impulse will be transmitted faster in neuron 1 because of the presence of this myelin sheath. Neuron 2 does not have a myelin sheath. Then you could say the other side. You can talk about neuron 2. If you do talk about neuron 2, you will say this. This all means that you could have said this option. Impulses will be transmitted slower in neuron 2 because of the absence of the myelin sheath. Neuron 1 has a myelin sheath. Do you see now that we are comparing it? So candidates lost marks here last year because they were unable to compare the neurons, and sometimes they did not even pick up that there's myelin sheath in the one and not in the other, or they didn't explain. Okay? Right. This is another question with the same diagram that was also seen as a problem from the diagnostic report. Same picture. Explain why a person will feel the stimulus but will not be able to respond if only this type of neuron is damaged. Okay, this neuron is damaged. Why can this person still feel something? They will feel that something happened, but they will not be able to respond if this one is damaged. Okay, so when we look at this question, I think a lot of the time, from what the report is saying, the candidates, the reason why they couldn't respond, they understood that the motor neuron will not be able to respond because it is damaged. Okay, so you will not be able to have a response. They understood that. But they didn't explain the other part. Remember that if you cannot feel the stimulus, that means there is something wrong with which neuron? The sensory neuron, right? Because they could not feel the stimulus. Remember, the sensory neuron is going to pick up the impulse from the receptor is going to now is going to pick up the stimulus and convert it, and the sensory neuron is going to play a role there. So that they will still be able to feel that because that is still going to happen. But it's not going to be able to carry out the response of the motor neuron because the motor neuron is going to take the information from the CNS and it's going to take it to the effector organ. But that neuron is damaged, so that cannot happen. So let's look at the answer. The central nervous system receives or interprets the impulses from the receptor or the sensory neuron, but no impulse will reach the effector. Okay, so it's exactly what I explained. But it's an explained question. So you cannot just say that the impulse will not reach the effector. Okay, yes, that is what will eventually happen. But why does it happen? It's because first, the central nervous system is going to receive the information. Okay, because remember, the question says they can still feel the stimulus. Going to receive it from the receptor, but no impulse will reach the effector. Okay, so the sensory neuron is still working. The other thing that where candidates lost marks is that the central nervous system, this word over here, CNS, was very important that they mentioned. A lot of them just said the spinal cord receives or the brain receives, but that is not the central nervous system. The central nervous system, as Radine mentioned earlier, is the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so that is another place where learners lost marks. Okay, right, let's move on then to the synapse. So you'll notice that I mentioned the word synapse earlier. A synapse is the point where an impulse passes from the terminal branch of the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of the next neuron. So let's look at this over here. We have this one neuron. Okay, the nerve impulse is traveling along the axon. It's going to reach the terminal branches, and you can see it's making a connection here with the dendrite of the next neuron. This gap is a microscopic gap. It's tiny, okay? But it's not touching. It's important that we understand that the terminal branches of the one neuron does not touch the dendrite of the next neuron. They actually communicate with each other via chemical neurotransmitters, okay? You don't need to know this diagram, but I just like this picture to show you, what is exactly happening. Is that we have this terminal branch, okay? It's going to, can you see this microscopic gap? It's not touching, but you can see these little red dots are the neurotransmitters that are actually communicating now with the dendrite, okay? They never touch, as I mentioned. It's the gap between the two neurons. That gap is called the synaptic gap. And the chemical neurotransmitters are helping to transmit the impulse from one neuron to the next across the synaptic gap. Now, what is the importance of this? The importance or the significance of this is that we ensure that the impulse travels in one direction. At the synapse, a nerve impulse can either be speeded up, slowed down, or blocked. Therefore, it enables unnecessary or unimportant background stimuli to be filtered out. So it's only the specific stimuli that needs to be passing through. It channels impulses so that reactions are integrated and become part of learning and memory. Okay, so they are very important. Also, a lovely diagram over here showing you the neurotransmitters and how they are actually communicating with each other, how the neurons are communicating with each other. Right, let's look at another question. This is once again on the structure. Okay, before we look at this actual structure, I want to mention something that I didn't mention earlier, but is very important. From the examination guideline, there are specific structures of the neurons that you need to know. Okay, they are axon, dendrite, cell body, nucleus, myelin sheath, dendrite, cell body, nucleus. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think cytoplasm is also there. Right, those are the structures that you must know. Those are the ones that are in the examination guideline. There are others. You will see in textbooks that there are others. Okay, there are many actually that you'll see, node of Ranvier or neurolemma. I'm not going to say all of them. Then those are the ones you remember. Don't mention those. Okay, we use the ones that are in the examination guidelines. So if you do see them in your textbooks, ignore them, and then these are the ones that you need to know. Okay, so if we look at this picture, let's look at number 3. These would be the dendrites. This is the nucleus. This is the cell body, the axon. Right, and then surrounding the axon you have the myelin sheath, and then surrounding the nucleus in the cell body is the cytoplasm. Okay, so let's look at this question now. Before we look at the question, once again the diagram. You see, I'm also forgetting. Right, we look at the diagrams. We have 4 diagrams here. You can see that 2 of them look similar and the other 2 look similar. Okay, so first identify them to yourself. We have number 1 is a sensory neuron, right? Okay, let's wait a few seconds maybe for you to tell me, or you can ask yourself which neurons are represented here. Okay, so wait a few seconds. Okay, we have number 1, which is the sensory neuron, number 2, a motor neuron, number 3, a motor neuron, and number 4, a sensory neuron. Okay, so you'll see here that, and once again spot the difference. Okay, so if we see that 2 and 3 are the same, what's different about them? Okay, and immediately you can see that number 3 has a myelin sheath and number 2 doesn't. Okay, number 1 has a myelin sheath and number 4 doesn't. Let's look at the questions now, because that is not what they're asking. They're asking us to give only the numbers 1, 2, 3, or 4 of 2 neurons that transport impulses from the receptor to the central nervous system. Okay, so which ones are from the receptor to the central nervous system? Remember, we said it is the sensory neuron, so it will be his numbers 1 and 4. Then we have which ones will have a faster transmission of impulses. So faster transmission of impulses, it must already ring bells for you to say myelin sheath. Okay? So here you have to identify the ones that have a myelin sheath. It doesn't matter whether it is sensory or whether it is motor, because it's asking us which one will have a faster transmission of impulses. Okay? So the answer will be the ones with the myelin sheath, which are 1 and 3, right? Number 1 and number 3, because they have the myelin sheath. Number 3 are damaged. So the two neurons that are damaged, if a person can feel the stimulus but is unable to react. So it's like similar to the previous question that we did. Okay, they can feel the stimulus, so the sensory neuron is working. Okay, you must relate stimulus and receptor to sensory neuron, right? It is working. Unable to react, reaction, response, you relate that to motor neuron. Okay, so this one can feel, but they cannot react. So which one is damaged? 2 and 3, which are the motor neurons. Okay, we have another question. This is from the DBE June 2018 paper. The diagram below represents a possible path followed by an impulse when a person touches a hot plate. So, this is giving us a lot of information. Let's have a look. It's a path. It's followed by an impulse when a person touches a hot plate. Okay. So it's going to be a reaction that must be fast, right? So name this path. What is this path? It is the reflex arc. If you said reflex action, it is wrong. Okay? Remember I said the reflex arc is the pathway that the impulse goes along, whereas the reflex action is the response, the quick, automatic, involuntary response that we're not thinking about, that we're doing it. Okay? So it's a reflex arc. Excuse me. Number 2, identify the type of neuron represented by B. Okay? So we'll look here. Okay, before we do that, sorry. Let's look at this diagram. Once again, didn't look at the diagram. If we look over here, we'll see that we have a motor neuron. Okay, we can see this is the motor neuron from the structure. This is B I'm looking at. B is the motor neuron. Let's just write it in here. Motor neuron. Okay, then here we have C, which is the interneuron. And we have E, which is the sensory neuron. Okay, sorry, I went very fast there. I didn't explain to you why. Let's look at why. B is the motor neuron because, as we said, that the cell body is on the one side. Okay, it's got many outgrowths here, which are the dendrites. These many outgrowths are the dendrites, but then it has one long outgrowth, which is the axon. Okay, which is going to end in terminal branches. So that will lead us to believe that this is going to be the effector, right? Then, if you look at the other side, why is this the sensory neuron I said? And it's because you can see the positioning here of the cell body. Okay, and then we see how it is branched out. And then F in this instance would be then the receptor, right? What else can we label? Or let's look at the interneuron. It's the interneuron because it's connecting the two. Remember we said the interneuron connects the sensory and the motor neuron. They are connecting the two, and it also has many outgrowths which are dendrites and then one which is an axon. And another label that we can label here is G. G, you can see it's pointing specifically to that outer cell, okay, which that layer is the myelin sheath. And then we have D, this point D over here. Okay, I'm not going to give you that answer because I think I'm giving you all the answers here. Let you think about that one. Okay, before we do it. What do you think that little connection there is called? Right, so B, yes, we answered it, the motor neuron. So it's the motor neuron. C, where is C? Yes, C is the interneuron. And lastly, an E. E is the sensory neuron. Yes, we already mentioned that. And then, oh, it carries on. Right, let's carry on with the picture. So with the previous picture, we labeled everything, okay? So we're moving on now to some more questions. Give the letter only of the part that represents the receptor, okay? So in this instance, remember, we look at receptor, stimulus, sensory neuron. That's what you think, sensory neuron. So then you go to the sensory neuron, what could possibly be the effector here? The receptor. It has to be F. Okay, look at the diagram again for question B. Which one is the effector? Once again, effector, efferent neuron, which is also known as, which is the motor neuron, right? We go to the motor neuron. What could it possibly be here? It has to be here A, which is the effector. Give the letter and name of the, before we go into that, once again, question, letter, name. When we ask for the letter and name, that is what we want, the letter and the name. Learners either give us the letter or they give us the name, and then you lose a lot of marks. Okay, so in this instance, we want the letter and the name. The region where the impulse is transmitted chemically. Okay, so that region, that chemically transmission, we are not talking about the impulse here. Okay, we are talking about the synapse. So where is that happening? It is D, okay, which is the synapse, right? This is the region where the impulse is transmitted chemically, D, the synapse. Then we have B, part that has an insulating function. It is G, the myelin sheath, right? Insulation, speeding up the transmission, that is all has to do with the myelin sheath. Right, then we come to the diseases of the nervous system, okay? According to the examination guideline, there are two that you need to know. You need to know Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis. Right, Alzheimer's disease, it is the most common form of dementia. And what is dementia? The speech bubble here will tell us that dementia is the general term used for memory loss and loss of other intellectual abilities. It usually affects people over the age of 65, although some people may develop early onset, characterized by loss of neurons and synapses in the cortex of the brain, as well as the presence of clumps of proteins called amyloid plaques and tangled bundles of fibers. So I just want to show you this picture here on the side of what a healthy brain looks like. It's similar to the pictures Radine was showing you earlier. You can see all of those ridges in the brain, and you can see that it's full, whereas in severe Alzheimer's, you will see that it's shriveled. Okay? And like we said, it affects the synapses in the cortex of the brain, and it forms these clumps of proteins called amyloid plaques. The cause of Alzheimer's is unknown. The symptoms, before we go into the symptoms, I want you to look at this picture over here that I've put. The healthy one, you can see the healthy neuron. You see how the myelin sheath, there's nothing obstructing the neuron. Okay, whereas in Alzheimer's, you can see these amyloid plaques, these yellow regions here are the amyloid plaques. Okay, so that's how it's preventing the proper transmission of the impulse. The symptoms is basically the loss of brain function, which results in slower thinking, behavioral changes, confusion about events, time and place. They also find it difficult to recognize people that they know. Difficulty in speaking, swallowing, and walking. There's no cure for it, although researchers are trying to find better ways to treat the disease, delay its onset, and prevent it from developing. And stem cell research and therapeutic cloning hold great potential for providing a cure for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so this is the information that you need to know about Alzheimer's disease. It is in the examination guideline, so you are expected to know it. The second disease of the nervous system, which you're expected to know, is multiple sclerosis, okay? Abbreviated to MS. It is a progressive degenerative disorder of the central nervous system, including the brain, optic nerve, and the spinal cord. It's normally diagnosed between the ages of 20 and 40, and it affects women more than men. Multiple sclerosis literally translates to many scars. Okay, so if you look at the picture, you will see here that this is an axon. We have a nerve fiber, and it's surrounded by a myelin sheath, this fatty layer that you can see is quite thick around here. But in this picture, you will see that there's gaps in it, and the nerve fiber becomes exposed. So obviously, there's going to be interruptions in the transmission and problems with the transmission. It is an autoimmune disease. Okay, so what do we mean by autoimmune disease? This is a disease where the immune system basically attacks the healthy cells in the body. And in multiple sclerosis, the specific one that it attacks is the myelin sheath. Okay, the symptoms of this is movement, feeling and coordination and balance. Okay, it affects them. It affects movement. It affects the feeling and coordination of balance. It affects vision, tingling and numbness, muscle weakness and spasms, fatigue, bladder and bowel movements, pain, concentration and memory loss, and mood swings. Okay, seeing the picture is also showing us a healthy neuron. You can see that there's nothing affecting it over here, and then we have also the regions here of the exposed nerve fiber. So there's no cure for this. Management strategies, basically a healthy lifestyle, okay, that we can maintain a healthy lifestyle to actually help us manage the problem. And the stem cell research has actually found ways to slow down the progress of the disease. Okay, I just want to recap on something. I have a few minutes left. If I can go back fast enough. Sorry, it's this one. Yes, I just wanted to go through again to explain to you that, to just recap about the neurons, right? So we need to know that the neuron is, it's made up of, it's a specialized cell, okay? It's the basic unit of the nervous system. There are three that you need to know: the motor neuron, the sensory neuron, and the interneuron, okay? And they work together in the reflex arc. They also work together to pick up, the sensory neuron is going to pick up the stimulus from the receptor, and then the motor neuron is going to carry out the effect, okay? Then you need to know how the reflex arc works and the reflex action, as well as the diseases of the nervous system, which are the Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis. Okay, thank you. That's all we have time for today. Please stay safe. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you for listening to us and for asking questions. We see that you are asking questions on the WhatsApp group. Thank you for that. We will respond to them. And enjoy the rest of your day. Please remember to stay safe, sanitize, wash your hands, wear your mask indoors. Thank you and goodbye.